It's my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Andrei Lankov, who is no stranger to us. He has spoken to us on several occasions for the past 15 years. Professor Lankov is Russian by birth and went to National University of Leningrad, where he received his PhD, and he also attended Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang. He taught at the National University of Australia in Melbourne, and presently he's a tenured professor at Kookmin University. I think he's the most popular and most sought after North Korean specialist. He wrote several books on Korea and also thousands of articles in newspapers and other academic journals. And today he's going to speak on different topics, but I think he can also share some of his insights on the current rather acute crisis on the Korean Peninsula. So, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Lankov with a big round of applause.
So I'm checking whether it's working. Is it working? So can you hear me all right? No. Right. Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, you can hear me. First of all, I would like to say that I'm going to talk largely, almost exclusively, on the topic which was advertised. We have been recently subjected to a wonderful exercise in hookah dance. You know hookah dance in Maori, New Zealand. When you just, jumping, try to look as dangerous as possible, you're waving your clubs and explaining in the most graphic language how you're going to crash, flush, slaughter the neighboring tribe. Then, well, everything is fine, and you go to have a drink. This is what we are going now, and honestly, well, I don't mind to talk about it too much, a bit, but hopefully not too much, because I'm going to talk about more serious stuff. Because people, when are talking about the future of North Korea, they keep forgetting that in the long run, all this kind of military exercises and diplomatic negotiations don't really matter. As has been shown by many examples, and it's suffice to remember how the Cold War ended, what is far more important is domestic development. And today, I'm going to talk about one of the peculiar features of the present-day North Korea. That is, if you like, female face of the North Korean capital. Well, to start this, many people can say, what about North Korean capitalism? Where is capitalism in North Korea? I would say everywhere. Because if you come to Pyongyang, of course you are not going to see much. When you are in Pyongyang, they work very hard to keep the old appearance. They try to show that nothing changed, when pretty much everything has changed. There are good reasons, because these changes are not improved by the government. Government doesn't know what to do about it, and they feel insecure, and maybe with good reasons. But in real life, everything has changed. Once you go away from the downtown Pyongyang, you'll see a market, and then another market, and then another market. And very soon you will discover that you are in a country where everybody is buying and selling and working in small workshops. Indeed, there have been some recent estimates which tells that roughly 80% of the income of the average North Korean family comes from private economic activities. 80% of the average income. But what is interesting, once you get to the markets, you will see female faces. Exclusively female faces. The new North Korean economy which plays such a major role, I would say decisive role, in the survival of the majority, has a distinct female face. This is a big difference with other post-communist countries, and I believe that North Korea, in spite of all this rhetoric, and the Kim family is still presiding over, is essentially a post-communist country. Because all state socialism is dead. It died unnoticed death about 15 years ago, a bit more, 20 years ago, in the mid-1990s. And what is important, in most post-communist countries, you are likely to hear complaints about the situation of women. People would tell you that yes, communism had shortcomings, but it did take women's rights seriously, while in most of these countries, especially less successful, poorer countries, women are at the mercy of the market. They're first to be fired, they have serious problems with finding jobs and everything. And they are seriously, well, there are actually volumes and volumes of volumes written about these changes, usually by people who are highly critical, but frankly, yes, what they say it makes sense. But if you look at North Korea, you see a completely different picture. Empowerment of women, collapse of state socialism in North Korea actually made women far more powerful. How did it happen? Surprisingly, women are successful because they were discriminated once. How it worked? Well, let's start from basic attitude of the communist regimes to women of communism. Initially, communism was very feminist. If you look at the early Marxist revolutionary movements of the late 19th century, they were probably the most devoted supporters of equal rights for men and women among all significant political movements. In the early Soviet policy in the after the Soviet Communist Revolution in 1917, they took equality, gender equality, very seriously. However, as time went by, it was discovered by the decision makers that it's always safer. Well, first of all, family is good for production. Second, it's always safer to rely on the tradition. So from the 1930s, the feminist experiments in the Soviet Union were quietly rolled back. And when communism came to North Korea, it was essentially a very patriarchic system. It was sort of assumption that, men and women are equal, but men are clearly more equal. So, if you look at how it was represented, yes, a woman was supposed to be equal, but again, if you were a kind of the higher reaches of power, everything, it was always a man. And the ideal woman was somehow engaged in industrial activity. She had a job, but her major job was to be a good wife and good mother in North Korea. Especially such trends strengthened in the 1960s, around 1967, 1968. And this had one interesting peculiarity. Most of the communist regimes badly wanted women to work. A housewife in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe was a relatively rare creature. It was not the case in North Korea. From the 60s, it was quite common for a woman to be a housewife. It was not seen as a problem at all. Government did not really press women to join the workforce, partially because of the diminishing efficiency of industry, because the crisis actually began to develop in North Korea as early as 1970. So, there was no really need for labor mobilization. So, women were sort of not exactly encouraged, but their unwillingness to work was generally tolerated. Then, what happened next? So, there was a very interesting, peculiar twist in the North Korean economic system. All men were expected to have a permanent job with a government enterprise. all able-bodied men. It was a crime for a North Korean man not to be employed. If you did not have a permanent work, you were just a criminal. Women were different. Women had to have a work until they married. And upon marriage, a woman could easily choose to become a housewife. So she was allowed to stay at home. It was partially a function of the perception of women as a kind of second-rate worker, and of somebody who should be, close to the kids. But it led to absolutely unintended consequences much later, in the 1990s. Because the North Korean economy was slowing down from probably the late 1960s, but it was kept afloat by the Soviet and Chinese subsidies. These subsidies were suddenly discontinued in around 1990-1991. Without subsidies, economy became unviable. Things began to fall apart. We don't know anything, we don't know exact figures, because you always have to keep in mind, when you read something on North Korea, the stuff you read is guesstimates. North Korea stopped publishing any meaningful economic statistics in the early 1960s. Since then, well, foreign trade statistics was published only once, in 1985. We have reliable population data, because since the early 1990s, North Koreans began to provide foreign scholars, advisors essentially, who are helping them with census. They were provided with access to their internal data, which is partially falsified, but it's very difficult to falsify demographic statistics, because it's so mutually connected. And we have foreign trade, because it takes foreign trade statistics, because it takes two to tango. And so basically, how it's done, it's mirror statistics. All these volumes, trade volumes, you can read about how it's done, because pretty much all countries, but North Korea, report their foreign trade to the kind of statistical agencies of the UN and other international trade organizations. So the people just go through the statistics and make kind of mirror image. Everything else is guesstimate. Having said that, it's estimated that the North Korean economy, the North Korean industrial output, shrank by roughly 50%, half, between 1990 and 2000. A disastrous famine began in 1996 and continued for 4 years. Between 500,000 and 1 million people starved to death. You are likely to hear the figures 2 or 3 million, don't believe exaggerations. But between 500,000 and 1 million. Rations stopped to be delivered. And before that, for decades, the average North Korean family relied almost exclusively on rations for its daily, I wouldn't say bread, and I wouldn't say daily rice, because rice in Korea still is and has always been a food of the affluent and successful. The average Korean eats, North Korean eats corn. So the daily corn was provided through rationing system. However, rations stopped to be delivered around 1992, 1995, depending on the area. And people began to starve, and actually most of the industrial enterprises also stopped. And what happened next? People began to look for how to survive, for ways to survive. And I would say that they essentially rediscovered capitalism. Because, well, when you have nothing to do, what is the most rational thing? Find something at home you don't need, go to the market. Markets had existed before. Markets had existed, but markets used to be quite marginal. Go to the market and swap it for food. Or better still, steal something from your factory and swap it for food. An ideal world, steal something from a factory, find a Chinese merchant, find a professional smuggler who will sell it to a Chinese merchants to China, and you make a good money. So there was a great multitude of activities. First, I will say, so something which is now known in North Korea as Chansa, which includes all kinds of non-official economic activities. Chansa. So, what are the major types of activities? To start with, the most common and the least profitable is private agriculture. If you go to North Korea, you see a lot of irregular plots on the mountains, usually on the steep slopes. Those are sothoji, small fields, sothoji, which officially don't exist. People go to the mountains, basically clean a field. If necessary, they put fire on the forest, seriously promoting deforestation, and they start working there. Usually, very high. You have to move all stuff there, all agricultural tools and fertilizer. You're usually stealing from the state-run agricultural cooperative. Everybody is stealing something. And so you move it there, but you still get harvest. Basically, the yield is roughly 1.5, 2 times higher than the yields of ideal, even fields and the valleys which are owned by the state, because people work hard there. Then all kinds of small production. People began to make stuff at home. I know people who were doing, doing cheap copies of the Chinese footwear, fake Chinese cigarettes. You basically farmers grow tobacco on these fields, sell it to you. You have some primitive equipment in home. You hire teenage girls for something like 50 cents a day to cut it. Then you use paper, kind of special cigarette paper. You usually buy from workers who steal it from the factories. And you go to a restaurant area, you buy packaging, Chinese packaging, which is, so it's, fake Chinese cigarettes. So it's just one of many possible scenarios. Workshops, private agriculture, trade, selling of everything which was sellable, all this type of activities. Plus, of course, cross-border migration to China, which by now has almost over. Contrary to what you are likely to hear, there is a very small number of illegal North Korean migrants in China now. But the numbers used to be very large, and it's the highest point, slightly more than 10 years ago, around 2000, 99 maybe, it was about 200,000 illegal North Korean migrants in China. Now much less, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 at most. Then, so people began to make money. But there was not much money, but barely enough to survive. But there was one problem. In order to go to the market, in order to go to workshop and make fake cigarettes, or to work at your field, or just to go to the market and sell, Chinese, electric fans. You needed what? A lot of things. You needed, in some cases, investment capital, which was another story. But among other things and above other things, you needed time. You had to go. And the government made quite explicit that people should still keep coming to their non-functioning factories. Workers were still and still are required to go to their factories and spend their 50 hours a day. They usually, not always, but in many, if not most cases, they have nothing to do. But they are explained that it's necessary to guard the equipment, to protect the factories until the production will be restarted at a certain point in an unspecified future. No, usually it's specified. North Korean propagandists promised that it would happen next year, but it has been, many next years have passed. So if men don't show up at their official government workshop, at the workplace, it's a trouble. It's a problem. If you miss one or twice, not a great deal. But if you start missing your official work too frequently, you are in trouble. Or most likely you will be sent to Taliban there, which is a kind of light imprisonment. You don't need formal judicial procedure to be sent there. It's just, if your local authorities decided that you didn't behave well themselves, that is usually a few months of mild imprisonment. So people don't like it, of course. And most men, plus there is an assumption, which is still, sort of lingering, but was quite powerful 10 years ago, that all this crisis is just a kind of transition period. So if men will misbehave themselves, it will basically be remembered, recorded, and will have bad impact on their children and grandchildren. Because North Korea is a society of hereditary classes. And it is very important, essentially, what your ancestors did in 1945. It's extremely important. Because you can be classified as a descendant of a reactionary landlord or a heroic revolutionary fighter. And the line is usually very blurred, much more difficult to distinguish than most people assume. But anyway, so there was an assumption that for the security of the family, man should still go to the work. Of course, there are some mechanisms to avoid these work obligations, of which the 3rd August contribution is the most common, because you can officially make monetary contribution to your factory to avoid and to buy right not to attend your work, and also not to attend indoctrination sessions and all kinds of self-criticism meeting and everything. So, well, if you pay, it's okay, you are not attending a lecture about the greatness of the leader, his father, his grandfather, and whoever. But some ton is a large contribution. And not everybody, only a minority can afford it. So, most cases, men are basically, well, they can sometimes get out, but majority of men cannot really work in this kind of new unofficial economy, because they are not allowed. They do a bit of, but they are essentially moonlighting, so to say. For women, it's not a problem. Women are allowed because, well, as soon as she is married, she is a housewife, and she can do what she wants. Women, because they were essentially marginalized in the old system in Kim Il-sung society, suddenly discovered that they have a lot of spare time which can be invested into making money into the new economy. So as I would say, they were pushed to the margins, but because the new economy began to develop at the margins, they found themselves in control of everything. And this is funny, because if you talk to the women now in North Korea, you will discover two things. Say, a kind of recurrent jokes about men who are clearly useless nowadays. Some of these topics are very common, like some of these jokes everybody knows. Say, what does a man and a house pet have in common? Cute. Nice to have around. And can scare robbers away. or say, what is a man essentially nowadays? A lamp in daytime. So it's useful. The sort of assumption which is nearly universal in most North Korean families. I will tell a bit later to which families it does not apply. But for the average North Korean family, there is a kind of assumption that man is, well, not economically significant. He is, if you like, a front person. His task is to keep up appearances, to represent the family in dealing with the official structure, to make sure that if things go back to normal, nothing improper will be recorded about this particular family. Because women can do a lot of things. What is interesting, if you look at some stories, you know, many of you know the story of Kang Chol-kwan. You know, aquariums of Pyongyang fame, yeah? Do you remember how his family got into prison? It was his grandmother who created all the mess. But, because he was a communist and activist and he was fighting for the great cause and everything. And she had quite an apolitical grandfather. But, when they moved to North Korea and when the political enemy of the grandmother engineered the arrest of the family, it was the grandfather who was arrested. It was an assumption that even if it was woman who is doing something wrong, it's still man who is responsible. Because he should take better care of his women. So he went to prison or probably was executed, And she, well, survived 2 years in prison and was eventually released. Even though she created all this mess. Anyway, it was just a kind of so this assumption that basically women can afford to do a lot of things with more or less impunity. So, as a result, we had this situation when, if you go to the North Korean market, and market is essentially, markets are taking over. I just wrote an article, not a long time ago, 5 years, 4 years ago, about geographic locations of movement of markets in some countryside cities in North Hungarian province. There is always a trend. Market used to be on the margins, and every few years it moved closer to the city center, and now in most cities it's essentially a city center. Market is sitting in the center of the city. Say in the city of Khviron, it was a small market in the countryside, then it moved to the railway station, and now, well, they closed down a primary school. They don't need it anymore because they have low fertility rate, like here, a bit higher but still not high, so they don't need that many schools. They closed down a centrally located primary school and remade it, redeveloped it into a market in the very center of the city. Anyway, so if you go to the market, you will discover that, say, roughly 75% of all merchants, of all vendors are women. And, well, so we had an unusual situation compared to other post-communist countries. It would be, however, a bit of oversimplification to think that it was a complete kind of change in the old gender stereotypes. Because if you talk to the North Korean market vendors, you discover that yes, certain things have changed, but not all. As you would probably expect, this dramatic increase in female power led to changes in the family relations. It's still seen as normal that a woman should do most of the household stuff. In a typical North Korean family, a man, having spent a few hours in his job, busily doing nothing, comes home, and wife is expected to, cook dinner and, wash dishes and wash everything, still. But there are families where it's not the case. Just a few days ago, I talked to one of such families, and here they are, well, I would not say defectors, because most of North Koreans in the south are not defectors. There was absolutely no political motivation behind their decision to move here. But anyway, I talked to one of the families, and in this family, a husband who was a university professor, which means essentially zero income, and wife was a large-scale operator. She began from small-scale stuff, and then she moved to large-scale trade with China. She bribed local political police. She invented essentially relatives in China who really did not exist, don't exist. She made fake invitation. She bribed political police to make sure that they will not ask too many questions, and she began to go to China regularly, moving garments, buying large quantities of garments for sale. So they ended up having quite rich by the standards of the local of the city. They were living in a nice apartment. Every family member had a bicycle. So they were quite rich. And in this family, yes, it was sort of assumption that it's the husband who did housework. And eventually they began to have a hired help, but usually it was husband. But it's a bit unusual. Nonetheless, still there is, in most cases, it's still a kind of traditional patriarchal assumption. There was another interesting attitude, a change in attitude to divorce. Because historically, North Korea was a country with a very low level of divorce. It was an assumption that divorce is a shameful act which should not be tolerated. Right now, people say that because of this kind of movement of women around, because women are making money, because they are less dependent, and because basically nobody really cares about the work unit. Because in the past, when you had a divorce, you would be criticizing your work unit and you would have some problems with your work. It's not now an issue. So women began to initiate divorces, and the government agencies, the bureaucracies began to take sort of soft attitude to the issue. So they don't see it as a problem anymore. So there was obviously a dramatic increase in divorce rate in North Korea, even though all relevant statistics is of course secret, classified, but everything is classified. But in this case, we can be sure that it has changed. However, what is still important? So there are changes. However, what's still important? If you look at the upper levels of the emerging North Korean capitalism, there will be far less female fascists. Most of the women are operators of, say, small-scale retail operations, small-scale private agriculture, a workshop or two. But if you are going up the food chain, you still see that the system is still dominated by males. And there are good reasons for that. You can make a living, a relatively decent living, with an income of, say, a few $100, maybe up to $1,000 a month, by doing some kind of private operations. But if you want to become really rich, which in the case of North Korea means if you want to make a few $1,000s a month, if not more, you have to have connections with the government. And with few exceptions, it's much easier for a man to have such connections. So, if you look at people who are running large-scale private enterprises, right now we can have in North Korea such things as, essentially private coal mines or private gold mines. As a matter of fact, I know one person who used to run a private gold mine in North Korea. Private truck companies, private bus companies. It's almost always males. Because you need connections with party officials, you need connections with state security. And these are almost exclusively male-dominated areas. So women have made serious advances, but not up to their kind of level of them. Not at the top of the emerging market system, which is still male-dominated, and this is unlikely to change. And the same is with all kinds of semi-criminal businesses, like, say, smuggling stuff to China. Because when they are smuggling, the major stuff which is smuggled from North Korea to China are things like traditional herbal medicine, all kinds of animal stuff, mushrooms, pine mushrooms, I mean, soniposo. And this type of things, and of course all kinds of the antiques, because there was a great deal of illegal archaeological digging. They were essentially robbing the graves of the Koryo period, which were located in Kherson, and I think they sort of have destroyed pretty much all archaeological heritage of Koryo period recently. Of Koryo period, yeah, which because it was located near the Kherson area. Most of the stuff is still done by males because you have to operate, you have to work together with local security. There is another interesting part of this new phenomenon. That is labor migration to China. I mentioned it in passing, I should dwell about it a bit more. Because, as I have mentioned, in the late 1990s, when things began to fall apart, one of the strategies, one of the survival strategies was escape. In 1995, 1997, and so on. Escape. And I mean escape to China. Because the border with China used to be essentially unprotected. I was on the border just 2 months ago, late February, and I was sort of surprised to see that now they really have erected a fence. Before that, from the Chinese side, you had zero protection of the border. Not zero, but very little protection of the border. It was essentially a very narrow river. On the lower reaches, Tumen and Yalu are relatively broad, but most of the length of the border is pretty much as broad or as narrow as this room. So you can you can cross to China safely. And what is interesting, most of this, usually it was presented in media as a kind of, political defection, everything. Nearly all cases had nothing to do with politics. People were just running away first from starvation, and then they were looking for a good market, for good salaries in China, where an illegal North Korean worker can easily make as much as $75 a month, or maybe up to $100 a month if he or she is very lucky. So, but in this movement, women were also pretty much overrepresented, because there were two reasons. First, most of this movement, again, women were easy to disappear, to go beyond the radar screen of the North Korean authorities. So they could it was easier for a woman to move across the country, easier to approach the border and to cross the border. Second, most of the jobs which were available in China, in the borderland areas, were jobs which were seen as traditionally suitable for women. Because it was to a very large extent, was essentially largely four types of jobs. Domestic help, work at restaurants and canteens, construction work, and timber work. Construction and timber was for males. But it was also more risky because it was a concentration and the Chinese police could easily discover. Once you were talking about females, they moved to China, and it was most of the work available was largely for kind of female work. And last but not least, women had a survival strategy of getting into de facto relationship with Chinese farmers. Because it was, and it still is to some extent, a very reasonable survival strategy for the North Korean labor migrants, which is obviously also available only for women. Because there is a great shortage of brides in the Chinese villages across the border. It's the same situation as here. Women are first to leave. They leave the city, they leave the village, they go to the city. And the men are left behind. So, the same as in China, the local farmers have great difficulties with finding a wife, especially if they are somehow problematic. Heavy drinkers, or widow with children, or old, or known to be lazy, or whichever. So, these people began to get women from North Korea. It's again usually presented as a kind of, people smuggling, that these unsuspected women are getting into this kind of relations that they are tricked. Not exactly. From what I see, it does happen, of course. From what I see, it's in many cases, if not most cases, women move to China. In some cases, this type of things are arranged. So women are honestly told that they are going to go to China to live with a Chinese farmer. And, well, of course, as usual, you manage go-betweens always extol the virtues, non-existent virtues of these farmers, but so there is a great deal of false advertisement, but it's not that to say that they were completely treated, or such things do happen, I say, it does happen. What is more risky, however, what is real, they can be sold to the brothels. It does happen. They can be said that they are moving to live with a Chinese farmer, and then when they are essentially kidnapped, it does happen, it's a big problem. But most cases, they just move, and this is, and again, a rather efficient survival strategy. And what is interesting in many cases, such unions last for a long time. Because when I said that there are a few thousand, maybe up to 10,000, and most, North Korean refugees currently residing in China, it does not include a very important group, a group of women who have been in China for a long time, and who have acquired real or fake Chinese citizenship. Because if you stay there for a long time, first of all, the Chinese authorities. Another thing I would argue with you often hear these stories about these evil Chinese who are just, looking for the poor North Korean migrants and want to arrest them and torture them and so on. Not really. Because they are probably less eager to find them than, say, US police eager to hunt Mexican migrants in Texas. So they basically just usually turn a blind eye to this, their presence, and they, even if a particular woman is known to be of North Korean origin, local authorities usually don't ask too many questions and don't leave her alone unless something happens. But there is another option. After a few years, it's possible to save enough money to bribe local officials into issuing fake Chinese IDs, so that women become proud citizens of the Chinese People's Republic. And in many cases, even their kids have no idea where mom comes from. And so I even know some people who managed to get such citizenship, then legally applied for a Chinese passport and came here on Chinese passports. It's not very common, however, because most of them I just talk to people who deal with these women quite frequently and try to help them, because a lot of ugly things happening actually. So they say that even in such case, they usually are reluctant to apply for passport because they are afraid that the shaky background will be discovered. But as long as you live in the obscurity of your tiny Korean-speaking village, because you have to, when I'm talking Chinese, in most cases I mean ethnic Koreans in China. Because this part of the China is dominated by the ethnic Koreans. So these people, these women, they just stay there, and we don't know how many of them. Estimates vary greatly between few thousand and few 10,000 women have acquired de facto Chinese citizenship, and they are staying in China. Well, what all this means? Well, what should we expect? First of all, well, it was kind of interesting change, I would say, which reflects a general transformation of North Korea, which is widely underestimated. Because, once again, when we talk about North Korea as a socialist, as a Stalinist, and everything, it's a seriously misleading. We are talking about a country whose economy, to a very large extent, dominated by private enterprise, and where, as I have tried to show, the government has relatively little control over many parts of the daily life. There are areas which are important, where government still controls everything. But in many areas, North Korean government has essentially surrendered control and turned blind eye to all kinds of changes which are not supposed to happen, but they are happening anyway. Well, 45 minutes are over, and just let's say spend other 45 minutes answering questions. Yes.
Dr. Lankov, thank you very much for your presentation. What does the future hold in store for North Korean women capitalists under a possible I'm thinking under a possible Korea unified under South Korean leadership? What does the future hold in store for women?
For a vast majority, nothing good. Because I explain. Because when we are talking about North Korean, it's a very important question. Because when we are talking about the North Korean capitalism, we usually see these people as essentially anti-system force, because they are exploited by the bureaucracy. Because bureaucracy represents an anachronistic, inefficient, and brutal system, and they obviously represent the way to the future. So we sort of assume that the growth of capitalism, male or female, it's not important, will gradually undermine the current system, which is probably indeed the case. However, what will happen after? What's interesting, if you look at the current situation in the post-communist Soviet Union, you will discover something interesting. Pretty much none of the top Soviet, post-Soviet, I mean Russian industrialists, of the current Russian oligarchs, pretty much none of them used to be a black market operator under communism. You know, just maybe months ago, I did something I rarely do. I have no time and not much inclination to watch TV, but by chance, it so happened I had no choice, I watched it. And it was a documentary sort of telling about kind of, not kind of, people like stuff, about intrigues in the Central Committee at the time of Gorbachev's rise and everything. And one of the key figures they discussed, well, it's maybe mentioned, but he was clearly seen as a big figure, one of the largest black market operators in Krasnodar in the late 1970s when Gorbachev was the First Party Secretary. A big, powerful man with a lot of money by the standards of that time. What's interesting, what has happened to him? He is running a small liquor producing factory right now. And most of the people who are now running the country are former high-level officials. Not high-level, second-tier officials. What's interesting, if we have regime collapse, and I strongly incline to believe that sooner or later they are going to have regime collapse, this new North Korean capitalists will have to compete with South Koreans. And you guess who is going to lose. What I keep saying, we see these people as revolutionary forces, but we forget what, and they are. They do perceive these North Korean entrepreneurs. They do perceive the North Korean bureaucracy as a swarm of parasites. They don't like them. They hate them. However, they probably don't understand that they share one same common interest. In North Korea right now, I would dare to say that there are only two major social forces which don't want unification. Party nomenclatura and new bourgeoisie. Why? If you are a woman now running 3 corner shops and a small restaurant with hard work, cunning, restlessness, luck, intellect, dishonesty, a lot of good and bad qualities, you will probably end up as a CEO of a large supermarket chain with one condition. As long as watermark and image are not allowed. If they are, you should be lucky. You should consider yourself lucky if you manage to keep your 3 corner shops. So, question is, do these people understand? Obviously not all. But I probably wouldn't go to excessive details why I'm saying the next sentence. Please don't ask me about sources. I will tell you some do, but not many probably. No way to quantify. But we have to keep in mind that if a regime will collapse, and if it will do a complete absorption of the South by the North, the people who have some chances to survive are not this kind of self-made women. Maybe some part of the old elite, only some part, will somehow adjust. So, you know, a local manager running some kind of big shop, or some, you know, somebody who is responsible for nuclear weapons production probably will survive and stay in control. These women, they are going to be crushed by the South Korean capital, South Korean technology, South Korean know-how. Some of them well, some of them not, but most of them. So this is a problem. If we have a unification followed by a complete absorption by the South, of the North by the South, their fate is, well, sorry fate. This is one of many reasons why I believe that if we have a crisis, I think that the best idea would be not a complete unification, but federation, confederation. Here, in South Korea, the South Korean leftists, I would cross out adjectives which I usually mentally apply to Chimbok-ha, this in anyway. And so when they love to talk about confederation, but when they do, they usually talk about, you know, confederation between current North Korean government, Kim family and South Korean government. It's not going to happen. But when I say confederation, I say about confederation between South Korea and the government which will emerge eventually in North Korea after crisis. Some, you know, National Salvation Revolutionary Committee of 5 provinces, name it. I have no idea how it will go. So don't keep North Korea as a separate state, a separate entity for 10 or 15 years. To make sure that North Koreans will not be crushed, will not become the second-rate citizens. Because if there is an absorption, we saw what happened in Germany, and it's going to be much, much worse. And it's not that I'm worried that much about, you know, market merchants. I do worry about them, but there are many other groups who will suffer a lot. So it's better to have a kind of confederation state where North Koreans will be somehow protected. And the South Koreans will need some protection against the North too in this case. So, well, so not completely, but, you know, with a separate, not complete unification. Confederation is a separate currency, separate central bank, separate government, restrictions on the North Korean, of the South Korean investment, maybe restriction on the cross-border movement.
Any other question?
I'm just curious. Okay. Thank you. In the North Korean markets, what is the medium of exchange? Are they using North Korean money or Chinese money?
Depending what they sell. Actually, all large-scale transactions, only in foreign currency. Large-scale defined as anything more than maybe a couple of $100. So if you are buying a bicycle, you probably will pay, well, 50-50. It's possible that you will pay in currency, maybe in local money. But if you are buying a fridge, or if you are buying real estate, and as a matter of fact, there is a real estate market, and a good apartment in Pyongyang would cost about $50,000 US, and very good, about 100,000, but it has to be very good. So if you are buying this type of things, it's always either US dollars or Chinese yuan. This trend has been around for a long time, and it was much amplified by the unsuccessful currency reform of 2009. Well, before the reform it had been the case, and it's much more the case after the reform, because now people, they basically don't believe, they don't believe their own currency.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have a question about capitalism and the use of the term. Because under capitalism, you need the rule of law, private property.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it seems that in North Korea, that it's inversion and markets is a certain thing. So it seems that it's market inversion, but not quite capitalism.
Well, it depends on definition, but it depends how you define. You might be right. But, well, frankly, I think that if you are talking about the 18th century, capitalism was not exactly a rule of law. But anyway, well, probably you're right. Because I know this argument. I have heard it from some people. They say, well, it's not capitalism because there is no property. There is sort of private property, but it's not protected, it's not officially recognized. I have heard these remarks. But well, I can rename it and say not capitalism from below, but marketization from below. Still same developments.
Professor, you're talking about the percentage of earning of the family into the market, which would be reached already 70 to 80%.
Yes.
But at the same time, other estimates talking about of the gross output, economic output of North Korea.
Yeah.
Still, the relative majority is owned by the so-called military capitalism.
Yeah.
Economy owned by military units. Which kind of relationship?
Because 70-80% is an estimate, not of the share of market economy in the general economy, or share of the GDP. It's obviously much lower. It's an amount of the income which in the average family is generated by the activities in the private market. So most of the income of the average family comes from market activity. The general share of the private market economy is, of course, small. Talking about whether it's military or this type of what is remained of the state industry, we don't know, because once again we are talking about a country with very murky statistics, and it's not that it's only classified. In many cases, I strongly suspect that they simply don't collect data, because in many cases I think that Kim Jong-un himself has no clue of what's going on in terms of its own economy. So it's difficult to say. But no, 70–80% is just income of the average family.
And which kind of, are there some relationship between one side of the economy and the other one? For instance, the military having great possibilities of have assets in foreign currency, access to foreign markets. There is a relationship between
military. First, the role of the military. First, talking about the military. First of all, one of the peculiarities of North Korea is the existence of the foreign currency earning enterprises. They existed since the mid-1970s, and they became very common in the late 1990s. These enterprises are officially established by the government enterprises and government agencies, and very often by the military. So military has its own network of enterprises. Last year, when Kim Jong-un began its campaign against the military, there was a major purge of the top generals and many other things. One of the things, there are reports that a significant part of these enterprises switched the kind of taking away from the military. I'm not sure whether it's true. Anyway, they are involved because these enterprises, officially how it works, a kind of a military unit is given some kind, given some kind of exclusive rights for some type of sellable resource. Say a military unit is given here. You can, fish for squid in this area. Only you can, only your unit, only a company of your military unit can fish for squid in this area. Problem is, the military doesn't know how to fish. So what they do, or collect pine mushrooms. Secret police is given the right to collect pine mushrooms. How can they do it? Very simple. They usually hire agents who are, it's very interesting, I'm now going to write a rather large and rather boring research article on this very interesting institution of these agents, who are technically, if they work for a military foreign currency earning company, they are given military ranks. They are no cons, but they are not cons, really. They are usually former black market operators who have money to invest and who have connections and know-how. So they make a deal. A local, commander, like two-star general, talks to this guy and he says, well, you are given these rights, we have these fishing rights. It's up to you to talk to the fishermen, to hire them, to use your Chinese connection to repair the boats, to get fuel. And it's your money. You will invest your money. And but we give you an opportunity to use our exclusive rights for fishing or for pine mushroom collection, for everything. In exchange for that, you will give us a certain agreed upon amount of money. I mentioned somebody who was owning a gold mine. It was exactly the same system. He was not working under the military, he was working under the party. The same foreign currency earning company of a party. They essentially allowed him to take over an old gold mine. He hired workers, he found equipment, he invested his money, he took care about sale of the gold to China. And as a part of this effort, he was paying quite officially a certain amount of money to the party, quite officially, plus a bit of bribes on top of that, to make sure that he is secure. It's how it works, first. Second, talking about wives. Officers have wives. And very often, military wives, women who are married to the military officers, they are involved with all kinds of economic activities. Some of them can use resources their husbands have access to, while some others do just kind of low profile, not just normal kind of this type of activity, selling, Chinese footwear. So military is much incorporated in this type of things. There have been reports about attempts to make, soldiers into a kind of professional workers to create this kind of military farms. As far as I understand, these reforms remain unconfirmed and didn't work out. But as I have said, military has its own enterprises, which are usually run by the military, but most work is done by the black market operators. And the females, the women of the wives of the military officers are trading like pretty much every single woman in North Korea. Because right now it's a kind of assumption, it's what I have heard a number of times actually when you're talking to North Koreans, the assumption that is an ideal match. It should be a woman from marriage, I mean ideal marriage. Husband should have power, as they say. He should come from a secret police, maybe just police, maybe party, official. And woman should have money. She should be a daughter of successful businessman or more likely businesswoman with some skills and connections and capital to do her business. Such family is going to be very successful.
Professor, you've given us the really general picture. You've given us a general picture about how this phenomenon is working on in North Korea. But I've heard there are a lot of regional differences and variances in North Korea, such as they have more control, the government has more control in Pyongyang, but it doesn't have that much control in the northern Hamgyong area. So,
yes, I was largely talking about the countryside, because the picture I described is largely about North Hamgyong and basically countryside, but not Pyongyang. Sarewon will be the same. Not Pyongyang. Because Pyongyang is a very special place. Pyongyang, if you go to Pyongyang now, there are the signs of minor economic boom. Because some of remarks I would like to make here. If you open newspapers, you read the stories that North Koreans are starving. No, they are not starving. They are malnourished. They are not starving. It's a big difference. Right now, North Korean economy is doing relatively well. The last 10 years has been a time of modest but quite palpable economic growth, which was estimated, if you look at the Bank of Korea, of South Korea estimates, it was estimated at roughly 1.4% a year over the last 10 years. So there were ups and downs, but the kind of the national average. Pyongyang, if you go to Pyongyang, you see probably first time in city history, you can see traffic jams occasionally. A lot of traffic compared to what it used to be empty city. Now not empty city. You see these posh restaurants, which are officially state-owned but actually private-owned. And you see a lot of people with a lot of money. But these people are usually officials. And this money comes from, because they are people who are controlling, either officially, through all this kind of official money, currency transfer, or unofficially, through bribes, all this economy in the countryside. Even if you are mining for gold somewhere in North Hamgyong, you still have to send a large part of your income to Pyongyang. And in Pyongyang, it will somehow be distributed, will drip down. So in Pyongyang, this type of independent activity is less prominent, and Pyongyang, to a very large extent, it lives quite well on it's using this activity in an indirect way. And in Pyongyang, the need for trade is lower because in Pyongyang, probably a majority of population are given regular rations still. Because right now, we don't know exactly how much, but seems like 30–40% of the total population are issued full rations, 700 grams a day. The remaining, remaining 60–70%, they receive incomplete rations or no rations at all. And the people who are receiving rations, they are largely in Pyongyang. So Pyongyang is different. What I have described is largely countryside.
How does divorce affect the work status of women in North Korea? How does divorce affect the work status of women in North Korea? You said before you have to be married
Yes.
in order to get the sort of impunity you were talking about.
If you divorce, you're still a housewife. You're still a housewife.
Okay.
You're still a housewife.
And how does the changing status of women affect social issues like domestic violence and things like that?
I don't know, but seems to be less. Because there is an assumption, it's what I hear quite frequently, that in the past, women could not get divorced, and it would be a big trouble. How? Because the question was, how would they leave this divorce or resolve the system? And now, well, they can basically run away from an abusive husband to just kick him out in many cases. And it's he who is going to suffer because he, well, he's probably not getting, well, if he's lucky, if he's getting rations, he can survive somehow, but not necessarily so. So I would expect that it went down significantly, because women can basically, they are more in control. But once again, it's not a complete or change. It doesn't mean that everything changed overnight. No, it didn't.
Actually, I've read on several occasions that women, contrary to what you said, actually that women are, everybody is engaged in so many activities daily, weekly, monthly, because of the mobilization and because the North Korean population is organized in units, small units, bigger, and also the workplace living
You mean church extent-wide, not really. First of all, if you are, even church extent-wide is much less intensive than it used to be. And for women, it's practically non-existent now. Yes, you are a member of your Sonton Women's Union. And on paper, as a member of your Sonton Men, you have to attend criticism session, you have to attend Chonchi political studies session twice a week, so 3 times a week. It almost never happens these days. So your PISA, your secretary, your Sonton PISA, just check boxes and go to the market. So it does not work anymore. What is also interesting now, there is a small but growing number of women, largely men too, but women, who manage to slip away from Church Sankhwa altogether. Say if a woman marries and moves to another area, to her husband, it's one of few cases when it's possible for North Korean to move relatively freely, simple. Very often she simply doesn't register herself for your Sonton Man, and even though, yes, there is this people's group in Minban, people are watching one another, but again they don't care anymore. So what you say, no. It's maybe until 15 years ago, but not in the last years. Talking about women, the men still they have to go unless they pay the special contribution. Women can skip it because this kind of organizational activity, indoctrination activity on the level of the women's union, it has almost completely stopped outside Pyongyang at least. In Pyongyang it might be still the case, outside Pyongyang clearly not.
What about in the caisson factory?
In caisson factory, I think they would have a lot, because these people are in dangerous environment. Yeah. I don't know how often they do Sankhwa Chonghua, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do Sankhwa Chonghua not on weekly basis, but few times a week. Because it was traditional. If you are doing ideologically dangerous work, if you deal with working ideologically contaminated environment, you have to do your self-criticism more frequently. So in this case, and once they are getting exorbitant salaries, one of the things, when people say that, you know, Kherson industrial zone is a slave camp, what the hell you are talking about? People, did you see anybody who is bribing to get accepted to a slave camp? Kherson industrial zone is a place where it's basically the best place regular legal jobs in North Korea. Yes, they are given $135 on the average, of which maybe $40 only reach the pockets of the workers. Around, say, $90, $100 is pocketed by the government. But still, you know, $40 for a regular job, it's a huge amount of money. It's a very good salary. So, and when you get a lot of money, you have to basically play the rules. Yeah.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, now that we speak of caisson, closing caisson, of course, means you have 50,000 unemployed women all of a sudden.
Yes, bad. Closing caisson means, well, it's what I would say. First of all, I don't think they're closing caisson. It's just an hour, hookah dance, a jump with a battle club. There's a very, 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 how to say, threatening look. Nonetheless, if they close themselves, assuming it's not impossible, I think it's not likely, it's still possible, let's assume. What will happen? First, good and bad things from the regime point of view. Good things, bad things, they are losing money. In 2012, they got roughly $80 million. $80 million income from Caisson. For North Korea, $80 million is not exorbitant, but a relatively significant amount of money. Second, these 53,000 workers will be on the street. Government has not the slightest chance to provide them even with normal rations, let alone normal payment. So, even if, of course, they are going to be explained, that it was just another provocation of the bloodthirsty. Yes. Nonetheless, people are going to be angry, and Caisson is a bad place to have too many angry people, because it's strategically located just between Seoul and Pyongyang, on the major advanced route to Pyongyang. What is good for the government's point of view, if the Caisson is closed? I believe that from the very beginning, Caisson was what Chairman Mao once described as sugar-coated shell. I don't think it was an intention of the South Korean leftists, because they have a very peculiar frame of mind, these people have. But it's an unintended consequence. Because North Koreans are exposed on daily basis to the South Korean life. They eat these chocolate pies, which have since long ago have become a symbol of prosperity and sophistication. They see South Koreans, and they occasionally interact with South Koreans. Even if they don't talk politics, and they strongly suspect that they do occasionally talk politics. But let's pretend they don't. They still see how the South Koreans look like, how they dress, how they behave, and as a result, none of this, not a single person among them, not a single person among their family members is now taking official propaganda at face value. So have I been an evil advisor to Kim Jong-un? I would say, your darkness, you should close it. It's poison sweet. They're giving you poison sweets. So probably from their point of view, it makes sense to close it. And this is why I'm very much supportive of all kinds of engagement. And especially things like Caisson Industrial Zone. Yeah.
Okay, let's give him the...
I want to be shameful. Can I be shameful? I want to express my special gratitude to the first chairman, Kim Jong-un, who is working very hard on the last 15 days, to market my new book. Because my new book has been just published. It will start selling very soon, and this is it's a kind of shameless self-advertisement. So if you are interested, it's called The Real North Korea: The Life and Politics in the Failed Stalinist Utopia, and I'm talking about how North Korea has become what it is now. And I could not hope for such a publicity. It's something, it's unbelievable. I'm sending my publishers, Oxford University Press, I keep sending them 3 emails a day. Pali. It's going to be over by the 15th of April. The 25th of April the latest. And then North Korea will slide back to its usual semi-obscurity. We have to put copies. As many copies as possible. Anyway.